Hi, my name is Girish Daswani. Welcome to the Everyday Orientalism podcast series. We're here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Everyday Orientalism, a public platform through which students, academics, and citizens reflect on how history and power shape the ways in which human societies define themselves. The platform foregrounds the histories and political struggles that those in power often seek to erase. Defined by Palestinian-American literary scholar Edward Said, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Featuring a stellar lineup of guests, we explore how Orientalism continues to have deep ramifications in our everyday lives for how we think about settler colonialism, liberation, and how empire and capitalism continue to exploit and dehumanize the majority of us. Since October 7th, 2023, two wars have unfolded in Gaza. The first is Israel's one-sided destruction of the tiny strip of densely populated Palestinian land. The other is a battle over how that story is told. This quote is from the introduction to the book, When Genocide Wasn't News, How Canadian Media Covered Up the Destruction of Gaza. It reminds us how telling the story of the genocide has been a difficult and uphill struggle. The authors, Martin Lukács, Jason Toney, and Dania Majid, describe how Canada's well-resourced establishment media have kept with, to quote them, a pattern of decades of distortion and spun a web of deceit, casting slaughter as self-defense, presenting makeshift weapons as a match for tanks and jets, and transforming Palestinians desperate for peace into a people lusting for blood. Close quotes. Instead of covering the news on the genocide, Canadian media have worked hard to cover it up, dehumanizing Palestinians, sanitizing Israel's violence, and privileging pro-genocide voices. Palestine has been willfully misrepresented for decades, and Canadian media is certainly not alone in this distortion of the news. Foreign media and media outlets, especially those in the US and in European countries, have parroted the official Israeli line about how events unfold in the region, even in opposition to the facts on the ground. Edward Said identifies this as a problem of representation. In his book, The Question of Palestine, Said writes, and I quote him, "Zionism always undertakes to speak for Palestine and the Palestinians. This has always been a blocking operation by which the Palestinian cannot be heard from or represent himself directly on the world stage." Close quotes. In the days and weeks following the Palestinian uprising on October 7th, fabricated reports about atrocities committed by Hamas were blindly repeated by US news media outlets like CNN and the New York Times, and they shaped the way in which the world understood Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. Despite being debunked by several journalists, including the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the Orientalist narratives about sexual assaults and the beheadings of babies became a justification for the genocidal killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians. These killings included the specific targeting of Palestinian journalists and their families, 308 of whom have been killed since October 7th, 2023. This is the highest number of journalists murdered by any single government or military in history. Israel's genocide in Gaza has been deadlier for journalists than the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, and World War II. In 2025 alone, Israel was responsible for 2/3 of all journalists killed worldwide. While the scale of the violence has increased, the systemic execution of the press in Palestine is not new. From 2000 to 2023, Israel martyred 46 journalists, and for over 2 years, the Israeli government has denied foreign journalists entry into Gaza. And journalists outside of Palestine who criticize the genocide or show support for Palestine have been fired or censored. Once again, such censorship is not new. Palestine Legal reported in the Palestine Exception that in 2014 alone, they responded to, and I quote them, 152 incidents of censorship, punishment, or other burdening of advocacy for Palestinian rights, and received 68 additional requests for legal assistance in anticipation of such actions. Close quotes. Israel has not stopped its path of destruction in the region. It has since illegally occupied almost a fifth of Lebanon and systematically demolished villages and massacred civilians, including paramedics and journalists. Israel's repeated ceasefire violations come as it tries to sabotage peace talks between the US and Iran. On Saturday, February 28, 2026, the US bombed a girls' school in Minab, Iran, and murdered over 160 schoolchildren. Since this illegal attack on Iran and the war that has unfolded, thousands more have been killed. To quote the US Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, "Death and destruction from the sky all day long." Close quotes. Accompanying this death and destruction has been disinformation, not just from Western news media outlets who participate in biased reporting, but also from segments of the Iranian diaspora. Terms such as double standards, misinformation, misrepresentation do not quite capture the intentional use of propaganda in such newsmaking. It is less about misinformation than about disinformation. In times like these, more people are turning to independent media outlets, depending on journalists who are known to tell the truth and who know the impacted regions well, who are able to see through the doublespeak of news propaganda. We have become more dependent on journalists who refuse to deflect, distract, and deceive the public, who provide the necessary context and complexity to their analysis of world events, and who hold power to account, as the late, great Robert Fisk wrote in his book, The Great War for Civilization, even in the face of intimidation and censorship. We are recording this on March 5th, 2026, as the war in Iran is actively unfolding and the genocide in Palestine continues. My guest today is an example of a truth teller and an important voice in independent journalism. Samira Mohyeddin is an award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker. She has a Master's of Arts in Modern Middle Eastern History from the University of Toronto and is a graduate of Genocide Studies from the Zorian Institute. For nearly a decade, she was a producer and host at Canada's national public broadcaster, CBC Radio and CBC Podcasts. She resigned from the CBC in November 2023 and is now the founder and managing editor of On the Line Media, focusing on critical and contextual journalism coupled with intimate conversations and informed commentary. She's also the founding member of the Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine. Welcome, Samira.
Thank you, Girish. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thank you for being here. I know how busy you are at this time and how much is going on in the world today, which must also occupy a lot of your time. Just for those of the audience who don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit more about how you got started in journalism?
You know, as you pointed out, I did a Master's in Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of Toronto in the Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations Department. And, you know, what do you do with a Master's in History if you choose to not go on to do a PhD? I decided to open a restaurant with my brother, and for 10 years I did that. But during those 10 years, I was writing op-eds, submitting works to local papers, the Toronto Star and other places. And then my friend one day, she said, "Are you getting paid for, all of this stuff you're doing?" And I said, "No, paid? What do you mean?" And, in my mind, I was like, "Oh, I'm just happy to be published." And she said, "No, you should be getting paid for this." So I went to journalism school at the age of 38. Everyone else around me was 18. Which meant that I ended up doing most of everybody's homework when we had all these stuff that you did together in class, the group projects, which was fine. I didn't mind that. But in that last year, the National Post, which wasn't the National Post that it is today, back in 2013, there were actually good journalists there. They were doing some good work. It wasn't the Zionist right-wing rag that it's become. They poached me for a project where we went to Winnipeg, which I had never been to before. And this was during the Silent No More movement where young Indigenous women were disappearing. And we went there and met with 12 girls. We gave them cameras. We taught them how to sort of document their lives and what it was. And it really opened my eyes to what Canada was. All the things that I was never taught in school, residential schools, 60s Scoop, all of this stuff, right? And this is back in 2013. And I realized that this was a country that, wasn't really ready to reckon with its colonial past and present. And so it taught me a lot just that 1 week. Mm-hmm. And I decided, this is the type of journalism I want to do. I don't want to be the journalist that sweeps into communities when there's a trauma and then, helicopters out and never thinks about those communities again. For me as a journalist, it was very important to build trust with communities and to have them see me as not just, this cliche of a voice for the voiceless, because they're not voiceless at all. The fact is that there are mechanisms set up to shut these people's voices out. And that was something that I wanted to break through. So that's the type of journalism I wanted to do. And, I was fortunate enough to land at CBC's national flagship show, The Current, at CBC Radio, which is a show that I think sort of hovers above the rest of CBC. I was able to do stories there that I wasn't able to do anywhere else, and I learned from some of the best in radio. But I also realized that when it came to Palestine, that there was an exception throughout the entire corporation. And I didn't want to be a part of that any longer, not in the midst of a genocide. And I had always, a year before I resigned, there were other things I wanted to do. And unlike many at the CBC, I was someone that was a full employee, which we called the golden handcuffs, which meant that I couldn't say certain things. And so when the genocide started, one of the first things I was pulled into my managing editor's office for was because I called the Israeli spokesperson Ilan Levy a liar. And he said to me, "You can't call him a liar." But I said, "But he's lying." And he said, "Yeah, but you can't say that." And it was a wake-up call for me because I realized if I as a journalist can't point out the lies, then what am I even doing? They call the lie context. They call it providing the other side. I call it manufacturing consent for a genocide. And so I decided I don't want to be a part of that. And, I founded On the Line Media, and it's been about 2.5 years now, and I'm very happy I did.
You've answered several of my questions in that one response.
Sorry.
But I want to go back to recently. You received the Ken Philco Prize from PEN Canada. Mm-hmm. And to quote them, this is a prize that recognizes an individual or institution in Canada who has advanced freedom of expression in Canada and shown courage in freeing information and ideas from restraint or interference, close quotes. At your acceptance speech, you said, and I quote you, "When I think about journalism, I think about insistence, about the refusal to relinquish one's voice even in the face of intimidation or exhaustion." I close quotes here. Can you expand on that for us here?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I was naive, but I really, when I left the CBC, I thought there would still be room to exist within this sphere of sort of legacy media, mainstream media. Now, I do write, the op-eds for the Globe and Mail, but, when I submit or pitch something that has to do with Palestine, it never goes through. So they exclusively want me to write about Iran, which is fine. But the exhausting part that I mentioned and the insistence that I mentioned in that speech has to do with the fact of, even though I had sort of left the mainstream media or legacy media, organizations like Honest Reporting Canada, for instance, which is basically a mouthpiece for the Israeli government here in Canada, they were still coming after me. So I realized that my voice was still important. When you leave legacy media, it's a big decision because you think to yourself, is there still room for me somewhere? And I noticed that people were still relying on me to tell their stories, communities, individuals. And so I suffered a lot, nowhere near at all of what people were going through in Gaza, I have to say. But as a journalist, the attempt to silence you continues, even if you're not in legacy media. I had my, family restaurant, the windows were bashed in on the evening of the anniversary of October 7th. I've had people try and write to the Globe and Mail to try and, no longer publish me. And, of course, the death threats and all of that continue. But I think the attempts also taught me that as a person, it's so important to still speak out. One thing that really stayed with me was that there was a graffiti artist in Gaza, and this happened in December of 2024. He wrote my name on a wall in Gaza and
Amazing.
said, "Thank you so much, Samira Mohyeddin, for being our voice." And that to me means more than any Pulitzer that I could ever receive or aspire to. And people maybe don't understand that, but as I said, I go back to the fact that to be trusted by communities that are systematically silenced within our media landscape is more important to me than anything else.
Can you tell me a little bit more about this silencing by legacy media in Canada? For example, the patterns of anti-Palestinian bias in news reporting. For example, CBC's language guidelines, I'm not sure that that's still in use now since Canada recognizes Palestine as a state, but it used to, or perhaps does, still forbid the use of the word Palestine, the use of more, let's say, evocative adjectives when describing violence perpetrated by Hamas, and more neutral language around attacks by Israel. Or the practice of, and this is research or a study done by The Breach from 2023 about how the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the National Post, it took 2 Israelis to have died to mention Israeli death versus dozens of Palestinians killed before one mention of Palestinian death. These are just some of the examples that I'm aware of. Can you speak about this pattern?
Yeah, the dehumanization of Palestinians is not new. But I would say that particularly in the media, and this might sound a bit strange, for listeners, because we think of, as time goes on, we as humans become better and more knowledgeable. But I urge people who are listening to this to go back and look at how Israel was talked about by journalists in the 70s and early 80s. Israel was called a colonizer. Israel was called an imperial state. Those were the words used to refer to Israel. And as time goes on, occupied territories became disputed territories. Right now in headlines, even when we look at Iran, what's happening on the ground, Israel isn't mentioned. It just says strikes. As if, nobody is doing this. They're just falling from the sky. And sometimes you even see Iran strike, which makes you as a person, these days people only read headlines. You're like, did Iran strike itself? These are sort of the absurdities you see. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. So I'll give you a perfect example. Nancy Waugh, who is one of the senior editors of the entirety of CBC News, somebody made a complaint, an official complaint, wrote into the ombudsman and said, why do you use language like slaughtered when you talk about what Hamas did? And when you refer to Israel, you might say strike kills many. And she said that using those adjectives is because, and I'm not quoting verbatim here, but she said because things happen from the sky, they're not as bad as looking at someone and, maybe stabbing them. That is so absurd. When you think about how you have to rationalize that, the language that you're using, it shows you that not only that people sit around and think about these things, right, that it's systemic, but the fact that Palestinians are so dehumanized that you don't think they're being slaughtered. You think of it as some sort of video game, they're playing Pong up in the sky, which is exactly, how these zit-faced IDF teenagers are, right? They're not seeing who they're killing. And when they do, remember, CNN had this just fucked up article CNN published of IDF soldiers saying, I can't sleep at night because I saw the bodies of the Palestinians that I rolled over their tanks. And instead of focusing on the Palestinians that were rolled over by tanks, it was this sort of the IDF being the victim in this poor boy, young man who, can't sleep at night because he committed these atrocities. So not only do we dehumanize Palestinians and Palestinian lives, but we empathize with the killers. Right? And I have to tell you, all this whole time this has been going on, I just think of Robert Fisk, who had this amazing quote where he says, through our journalistic cowardice, we make it easy for the victims to become the aggressors and the aggressors to become the victims. That's how Israel is framed. Can you imagine any other country where we would frame a state of what Israel's crimes and what it does as the victim? No one else would get away with this but Israel.
You mentioned at one point in time that people could write about and call Israel a colonizer. They could talk about the occupied territories. And then there was a shift in language. There was a shift in the ways that these descriptions were being published and broadcast.
Yeah, it was a mark, you could mark the time.
And when is that? When did that happen?
So it happened after the Sabra and Shatila massacre. In 1982, the Lebanese Phalange, with the massive help of Ariel Sharon and the IDF, invaded Lebanon and massacred thousands of people, including Lebanese and Palestinians. And that was the first time you saw broadcast of this massacre. People were seeing women holding their toddlers just ripped open, killed. I mean, it was horrific imagery, and it was being played on prime time. And that is when Reagan, who was president at the time, called the Israeli, and I forget who was in power at the time. It wasn't Sharon that he called, it was the president. I forget who it was. Called him and said, "Stop this now." And they did. Within 15 minutes of that phone call, it ended. And the reason I bring that up is because, Biden could have stopped the genocide with that phone call also.
Absolutely.
He chose not to. But it was then that you saw this Hasbara department be developed, right? Hasbara means explanation in Hebrew. And that is when Israel went on the PR offensive. You didn't have that before. So you had, NBC, even people like Dan Rather would sit and say, they are massacring people in reference to what Israel was doing. But it was after that time that Israel started to develop a huge PR campaign in making itself out to be the victim and creating this Islam that the world was going to take over, which is their tactic right now. It comes back to their tactic that they're using right now. And everybody is coalescing around that, right? Far-right Christian nationals, everybody. Islam is being made into the boogeyman again. Yeah. So that is sort of the place that you see a real shift in how Israel was being portrayed.
Now, things haven't changed in so many years, and things were obviously they most probably escalated from 2001 when there was a rise of Islamophobia, and with the Palestine exception as well still being very real. Censorship is a huge thing with anyone working in journalism right now, especially when it comes to this question of Palestine. And I know you faced a lot of censorship even when you were working for the CBC in your career as a journalist. I know of one, right, when, for example, Honest Reporting Canada, who love you, it seems.
Yes, I'm in their Hall of Fame.
Made a complaint about a podcast show that you hosted, Unforked, on, of all things, hummus.
Hummus, yes.
2021.
That Israeli invention, that Israeli national dish, yeah.
Can you speak a bit more about the kinds of censorship that you experienced and what it did for you or to you?
At the CBC, we start out as associate producers. I, according to others, moved very quickly from associate producer to producer. Normally, you can be in that role for years until you're bumped up. But there was one summer where there was a call out within the building for podcast pitches. And I had done a magazine when I was in journalism school called Unforked. And it was sort of looking at the politics of what is on your plate, right? The culture and the politics embedded in it. Because I think food is an area that isn't explored enough at all. And so I came up with all these segments, and they loved the pitch. They took it. One of the segments that we did was on gastro-nationalism. First, we spoke to an indigenous chef who was using cuisine as a sort of taking back of his culture. He didn't cook bannock at all. He, cooked with seal and berries and all this stuff, sort of reclaiming indigenous foods and foodways. And another segment was looking at hummus. And the reason I did that was because Israel declared hummus as its national dish. Now, that's absurd, right? Israel didn't create hummus. And so, we spoke to Leila Ahmed, who was a very well-known cookbook author, but also an activist. She's from Gaza. She was the one where, when Anthony Bourdain went to Gaza, she hosted him there. She's brilliant. And she was one of our guests. And the other guest was Afua Hirsch, who is a Israeli-based sociologist. She's brilliant, and she looks at how Israel uses multiculturalism to show itself as this multiculti paradise where apartheid doesn't exist and all this stuff. And in that segment, we looked at hummus, and Afua Hirsch talked about how people from Yemen who are in Israel, Ethiopia, etc., how their cuisines get used by Israel to show that it is, as I said, this multicultural paradise, and how there's no apartheid system there, through the use of food. And at one point in the podcast, Leila Ahmed said, I can't even go to Akka and these other places to eat hummus because I'm not allowed as a Palestinian to enter those areas. I can't go back to the villages of my grandparents, etc., where these recipes originated from. And at one point she mentioned the Nakba. Now, we had producers on this show. I had an executive producer, and she said to me, "Oh, Nakba, we need to tell audiences what that is." And the moment she said that, my spidey senses went up, and I was like, uh-oh, this is going to be a problem. And I said to her, "Are you sure you want to explain what the Nakba is? Because we're going to get complaints." Now, I don't know, maybe she was naive, she didn't know, but I knew. When Layla Ahmed said Nakba, as a side, we sort of stopped the production, and you hear my voice come in, and I said the Nakba means disaster. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from hundreds of villages. This was an ethnic cleansing. And then we go back.
Wow, you actually said that.
To the guests.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
And now, more background. This was a show and a segment that was so overproduced. So we actually had a group of listeners to give us feedback. That's not normal, okay? So the reason I say this is because it went through multiple layers of managing editors, senior producers, executive producers. It went to air, and just as I knew, the complaints came in. And Honest Reporting has about 60,000 subscribers. Most of them are geriatric pensioners who, get this sort of letter written for them, and they just put their name to it and it goes off. But what it does, as an executive producer, you receive these emails and it will clog your inbox with thousands of complaints. All of them the same wording, everything. So but as a public broadcaster, you still have to respond. So imagine being an executive producer and me as a producer comes and pitches Palestine for you. Are you going to say yes or are you going to say no? You're going to say no because you don't want to deal with the letters. And that's what happens. So when this happened, I started being called into meetings, meeting after meeting after meeting. Why did you do this? Why did you pick that guest? Why didn't you do that? Blah, blah, blah. 8 months.
Wow.
8 months of meetings. That's not normal. And that is, I know we talk about the Palestine exception, but that is the Israel exception.
Can you tell us what that means?
To me, it's more important to talk about the Israel exception, which means that we don't treat Israel the same way we do any other state. We treat it, as I said, first of all, it's the victim. So the complaint that came in from Honest Reporting, and this is wild, the wording that they used, is that because we said that hummus is a Palestinian-originated dish, we are taking away Jewish indigeneity in the land. That's brilliant. I mean, if that isn't a brilliant form of PR, I don't know what is. Because the Hasbara of the Israeli state has changed over the years. In the last decade, they've started to talk about how their occupation is actually a decolonization. It's a beautiful inversion of apartheid. And I give them kudos for it because it's effective. To people who don't know the history, I should point that out, which is...
Quite a few people.
Well, it's actually the people who are running these corporations and media outlets. They are highly ignorant of the history. And this is another reason why I left. I didn't mention this. I quickly realized that my knowledge was a liability for my employer. It was not an asset. The fact that I have a master's in modern Middle Eastern history should have meant that I was the one who was covering this the most. But it actually meant that I was reduced to covering chickens and ducks and whales during the genocide. And you may laugh, but that's exactly what they were putting me on. They were putting me on stories of whales and, what ducks were doing and chickens. I mean, you could go back and look. That's what I was covering. That's what I was put on. And so it was to remove me from the story because I knew things, because I see a pattern. When Israel bombs a hospital, I know that it bombed hospitals in 2009 in Operation Cast Lead. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't know who bombed the hospital, right? We play a pretend game with Israel. which allows Israel to say, we have no verification for this. We would never do this. I mean, we don't do that. It is, Palestinians or Hamas who uses people as human shields. That is what gets perpetuated over and over and over again. So when it comes back to my show, it allows Israel and its supporters, like Honest Reporting, to then play the victim, even when it comes to hummus, chickpea, tahini, lemon, olive oil. We own that. We won't even give that to the Palestinians.
It's been very effective. I mean, in the media, and one can say it extends to a broad range of institutions, including at the university. I want to share with our audience what an Israeli journalist who wrote a column for Haaretz, Amira Huss, said to Robert Fisk.
The amazing Amira Huss.
The amazing
yes.
Amira Huss, about the misconception around accountability. And I quote her from Robert Fisk's book, that what journalism is really about, it's to monitor power and the centers of power. So what she was saying is it's the role of journalism is to record and to challenge centers of power. And Robert Fisk took this to heart. He made this his own motto. Can you speak a little bit more about objectivity in journalism, especially when it comes to the coverage of Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, objectivity is a weapon. Objectivity is weaponized against journalists who want to speak the truth, particularly when they're covering Israel. You know, Robert Fisk was a person who lived among the people he reported on. Chris Hedges, another reporter, speaks fluent Arabic.
Yes.
He took it upon himself to learn the language. These are people who have lived experience of covering communities. And they're not liked. And they're okay with that. But that's exactly what a journalist should be. You see, nowadays, and this goes back to the editors that I had and executive producers, they think that journalists are supposed to be liked. Journalists should be feared. They should be feared by people who are in power. They should be feared by government officials. They shouldn't want to come onto your show. They should be made to come onto your show because you are going to hold their feet to the fire. These are the people who run our lives. These are the people who we give our tax dollars to. These are the people who are waging wars in our name. But for some reason, when it comes to Israel, we don't hold Israel to account. Israel is just allowed to kill as many people as it wants. One of the most atrocious things, and this is just one example, is the systematic killing of Palestinian journalists. We have organizations, and by we I mean Canadian institutions, organizations like Journalism for Human Rights, the Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression, Canadian Association for Journalists. All of these organizations, you would be hard-pressed right now to see even one on the killing of Palestinian journalists. Nothing. They've said nothing. Whereas, when the Ukraine war started, the second day they had put out all of these, bold and like bellicose statements about Russia and the killing of Ukrainian journalists. And I don't even know how many Ukrainian journalists have been killed. It might be 4 or 5. But they were very quick to come out and call this out. But when it comes to the killing of hundreds of Palestinian journalists, they have nothing to say. I was so naive. I really thought that there would be mass walkouts. Mm-hmm. I really did. I thought that we as a community of journalists would walk out and do something. But when the head of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate was given an award by CUPE, this is just in December of 2024, he had come here. He had come to Canada to receive that award in British Columbia. No one interviewed him. I interviewed him, but no one else did. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that the head of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate had come all the way from Ramallah to BC, and not a single Canadian outlet interviewed him. We would have never done that with any other state broadcaster, any other state publication, anyone else who was coming here to receive an award from the largest union in Canada.
Can you speak to this double standards? Because, it is really shocking to hear that. Firstly, also, I know that you've been greatly impacted and affected by the deaths of so many Palestinian journalists. I've seen and be moved as well by all the killing, but specifically the targeting of Palestinian journalists in such a vicious, cruel way. Hundreds. And yet, what you're saying to me is that all these associations, unions, and groups of journalists that could speak about it or speak out about it have not. What is it? Is it fear? Is it the cowardice? Is it racism? What is it?
It's a combination of all of that. There is such a fear among journalists of being called anti-Semitic. There is a real fear around that. And that fear is warranted because the moment that you get that title put on you, you are pushed out of the system. And that happened to me. I was, in the October of 2024, the Israeli government, the Ministry of Diaspora and Combating Anti-Semitism, put me on their list of top most anti-Semitic people in the whole of Canada.
That's ridiculous.
Now, when that happened, at first, I've just felt a chill go through my body, honestly. But then I got an email from Gidon Levy, who is a columnist at the Israeli outlet Haaretz, Israel's oldest running news media outlet. He wrote to me and he said 3 words, 4, wear it as a crown. And I started to investigate who this ministry is that put me on this list. This is a ministry run by Amichai Shikli that last year paid $25 million to an Israeli marketing company to create thousands of fake Facebook accounts to push the Israeli narrative to U.S. lawmakers. You can look that up. It was even covered by the Times of Israel and the New York Times. Okay. I didn't have to dig far. But what I'm saying is that these are the mechanisms that are used to silence people. So it is, yes, fear among journalists. It's also racism. Look, what's the language around the killing of Palestinian journalists? The Foreign Press Association keeps asking to go into Gaza. They keep asking the Israelis, let us in. Fine. Why aren't you in the occupied West Bank? Why aren't you covering what's happening there before you can go into Gaza? Cover what is happening in the occupied West Bank. No one's preventing you from going there. Why aren't you on the ground there? You know, this disassociation that we have between okay, that's Gaza and this is the occupied West Bank. No, they're one. They're one. Cover it properly. So they're not doing that either. And then when it comes to, go back to the reasoning that why this doesn't happen, the other wording that we're seeing around this is when people are saying, well, we can't verify things. There's no journalists on the ground in Gaza. So you dehumanize the Palestinian journalists by making them already out to be not people that are providing you with real information.
Exactly.
So you buy into that Pallywood, as they love to call it, where you position these people as unobjective, right? Come back to that objectivity, and not people that we can use as a verifiable source. I'll give you a little bit of an example of how this would play out in my own life when I was in legacy media. It was very rare for us on radio to put Palestinians on the air live. We would pre-record the Palestinians, but we would put the Israelis on live. And we would more than often put the Israeli voice on last. They would get the last word. That is a perfect little example of how Palestinians are dehumanized.
Yeah. And that still happens. I mean, that is the pre-recording of Palestinian voices, expertise.
Controlling what they say.
Controlling what they say. And if they don't say it the way they're expected to, they're not actually invited into the show. Wow. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you're a founding member of the Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine. And this kind of speaks to potentially why you thought there was a need for something like this. So what is it that you do, and why do you think it was necessary to have the Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine?
You know, I formed this. I'm one of the founding members of it. There are 10 of us founding members, and we now have over 80 members across Canada. We formed this organization last April, and we did it in the midst of watching, as I said, hundreds of Palestinian journalists being killed. And some of these journalists, I have to point this out too, were working for outlets like Reuters Associated Press. So this isn't just citizen journalists we're talking about. They were providing footage for outlets that they are the outlets of record. They are the outlets that put out things over the newswire that then people like the CBC, CTV, and others use. And amongst all of this, I started talking to my colleagues, some of them who still work at Legacy Media, and I said, this is atrocious. And I was looking at, in apartheid South Africa, what the media was doing around that time, how they were making connections with journalists inside the country who were trying to make change. And I said, we need to connect with Palestinian journalists inside. There is this disconnect, and we don't see them as colleagues in a way that we would. Let's connect with them. So we reached out to the Palestine Journalists Syndicate. They were gracious enough to join us and accept us and give us a letter saying that we are on board with you. And so what we do is we monitor what is happening on the ground, not just in Gaza, but in the occupied West Bank. And then we also monitor what is happening to journalists who report the truth. So, one of our best sources is just Honest Reporting, who does our work for us. And the things that we've done in the past year is on World News Day, we went and took our message to Parliament Hill. We had a press conference there. I myself gave testimony to the Gaza Tribunal in Ottawa.
Yes.
And talked about sort of the complicity of Canadian media in this genocide and beyond. And, we continue to, for instance, one of the other projects that we have right now is to provide a letter to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. For the first time, a national museum in North America will be having an exhibit of the Nakba. In June 2026 in Winnipeg at the Museum of Human Rights, Zionist organizations like CIJA and B'nai B'rith are trying to shut down this exhibit. And I think it's very important for Canadians. We did this as an organization, but I really want to urge all Canadians who care about the truth, who care about providing history, which is important, to write to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights and thank them. Palestinian communities in Canada have been working on this for more than a decade. And it's important that people who are government officials and people at these types of institutions that are government funded understand that this is what Canadians want. They want to see this type of information. They want to know what's going on. And so that's another thing that we're doing.
Amazing.
And the other thing that I think I want to tell people is that a journalist that I've been working with on the ground in Gaza, we want to have an exhibition of his amazing photos that he's been taking. We're hoping to have that up sometime in May or June of this year. So that's the type of work that we're doing. But really, essentially, I think it's deplorable that we don't have connections made with journalists who are Palestinian that goes beyond just asking them to do work with us. We use them and then just toss them aside. I think that in order to work towards Palestinian liberation and to be able to tell the truth of what is happening on the ground, it is important to work with Palestinian journalists, not just in a capacity that uses their, footage or whatever, but to ask them, what does liberation look and feel like for us then to help them through that process?
Absolutely. And this is really important work. It's just shocking how few people are actually doing that. And I'm so happy to hear that this is what you're doing with that. So you talked about South Africa. You talked about the coverage of South African apartheid. And I also know that you've covered the student encampment at UFT. You are making a documentary.
Yeah, it was a life-changing experience for me.
And I'd like to hear more about that. And I'd like to hear more about your experiences of covering it, your observations, but also to the parallels that you often make between South Africa and Israel and the coverage of the student protests against apartheid and genocide.
A week before the encampment at the University of Toronto started, I received a message on Signal from someone who said, I'm a student at the University of Toronto. We are going to start an encampment there. We'd love for you to cover it. Now, on Signal, you're not always sure who you're talking to. And I was wondering when Toronto was going to do something. Columbia had already gotten underway in New York, and I said to him, okay, let's meet up because I need to see you face to face. I need to know that you're a real person, verify all of this stuff. So we met at a cafe on College Street here in Toronto, And I didn't know who I was looking for. And this, young guy came and sat, and we talked for about an hour and a half. And I was so impressed with him, how smart he was, how detailed, that he just knew the history of the region, and just brilliant young mind. And I said, okay, when is this going to happen? And he said, we're having our last meeting on this day. We'd love for you to come. And I went into this room. It was in the basement of a church here in Toronto. And there were all these young kids and tents like moving back and forth. And they had made this sort of, they had a white board and had a map of, U of T and the lawn and what their plan was. And I remember thinking, oh, this is not going to work. Like these guys are, the police are going to come in. And because I had seen what happened in Alberta, right?
Yeah.
They were ruthless, the police at the University of Calgary. And, they said, please be here at 4 a.m. And I showed up at about 3:30 and was sort of staying at the periphery of the lawn, looking to see what was happening. And sure enough, at 10 to 4, they all scrambled on, they broke down the fence. And, the U of T had already put a fence around this area.
Yes.
So it was perfect for them. I mean, not very smart of U of T, but they used that fence to their advantage brilliantly. And away we went. For the next 63 days, I was there every day, sometimes for 3 hours, sometimes for 8 hours, covering the daily activities of what happened. And then the cast of Zionist characters that would come outside trying to create havoc, calling these students racist, terrorists, some of them getting extremely violent. And I was able to cover all of it. So at this point right now, we're putting a documentary together. We have a wonderful team, and we're hoping to have it done by the middle of May, because we want to submit it to TIFF for this year. Wherever it goes, I will make sure that there will be numerous showings here in Toronto for the community itself, because to me what's most important, again, was for these students to feel that what they did was archived, and to see that what they did was something that gripped this entire city and country for 63 days. Yeah. It was a very important act. And in the documentary, I make the through line to show that what these students did is a direct through line from what students did on campus during apartheid South Africa. The Caribbean Students Association for a decade was asking the University of Toronto to divest, disclose, and it took a decade. And U of T went kicking and screaming towards divestment. They were one of the last universities to do so. Now, if we want to go back to the coverage, which you asked me about, I'll take the CBC as an example. They covered those students in exactly the same way they covered the students today in 2024. There's actually some footage that we're planning to use from the CBC. Glenn Babb, he was the South African ambassador to Canada during apartheid. He was invited by the Law Society of the University of Toronto to come and give a talk. U of T told students that if you protest, you will be expelled immediately. The U of T Drama Club did something that was so ingenious. Every time Glenn Babb spoke, they came dressed to his talk like KKK members, full on. Like they had the cone heads, everything. Every time Glenn Babb spoke, they stood up and clapped for him.
I've seen the footage, yeah.
It's brilliant. Yeah. There's nothing more to say, right? And that, to me, that type of activism is so brilliant, because all you're doing is you're holding a mirror up. And that is the best way to react to people. Allow people to show themselves. Now, how did the CBC cover that? They called, the exact phrasing from that journalist was, strange students, irrational students. At one point, she even calls them racist. She portrayed Glenn Babb as the victim. She portrayed Glenn Babb as the rational one. She actually said, Glenn Babb, who quoted Coleridge and Milton, she portrayed him as this educated man who just wanted to come and explain. She doesn't say he came to whitewash apartheid. So what type of journalism is that?
I think the parallels that you are making between what happened then and the journalism that allowed for that whitewashing of apartheid is very similar to the reporting of the student encampment at U of T by Canadian journalists at that time.
Yes, the students also at U of T were called racist, anti-Semitic. However, when they launched this injunction, right, they criminalized their own students. Don't ever forget that the judge says there was nothing anti-Semitic about that encampment. It is on record, and that is one of the biggest, most important things that came out of that injunction, right? And don't forget, Girish, and I'm sure you probably know this, but I think it's important for listeners to know that apartheid South Africa also portrayed itself as a victim, right?
Exactly.
Even the forming of the state itself was because they portrayed themselves as a victim. They came to that land, without a people. Who does that sound like?
Like Israel. And your coverage was so crucial, important, essential to documenting the racism that was used against the students, the groups of Zionists and white supremacists, and
So
just
absurd.
agitators that came to the encampment to cause trouble, including certain faculty members of the University of Toronto.
Yeah.
And you captured all that. Just by being there, you documented that. And there's no way that anyone should be able to say that these things did not happen. And
That was the most important thing to me. When the encampment started, I really wanted to make sure that what was happening on the inside of the encampment was documented, because I knew how the media was going to portray this place, calling it Little Gaza, calling these students anti-Semitic. I knew that was coming. So for me, it was important to juxtapose what the mainstream media was doing with what was actually happening on the inside. Teach-ins from brilliant people, poetry readings, prayer, soccer games, children flying kites. I mean, it was a little utopia that was created.
Absolutely.
Right? And nobody who didn't experience that, right? When we talk about helicoptering type journalism, that's exactly what I'm referring to. The journalists, I saw them, some of my former colleagues would come in there, treat these students like infantilize them, treat them like patronize them and, why are you doing this? What are you trying to get out of this? I mean, and when the students would start to explain and they're like, yeah, well, we heard somebody say this statement, anti-Semitic statement, yesterday. What do you think about that? And it was this sort of constant clownish behavior, which, at some point I was like, it got a little uncomfortable for me, because I was looking at people who were former colleagues and thinking, my God, I've seen you do much better journalism. Why are you looking so pitiful here? I heard a CBC radio host go harder on a student, a University of Toronto student, one of the spokespersons, go harder on her than he did an Israeli spokesperson. What power does that student have? If you talk about the fact that we are supposed to hold power to account, why would you go harder on a 21-year-old than a person who is speaking on behalf of a country committing a genocide? It was so wild to behold. And again, it was important for me to archive this moment because of the band of characters, the clowns that would come outside of this place every day and try to portray themselves as the victim, even when they were trying to literally push their way into this space. When you know that they were just coming in to agitate, to film the students, to then put them on canary mission. And I think what I was able to capture was not only the sacrifices that these students made, but the cast of clowns that were trying to bring down this action and portray it in a light that I'm hoping this documentary will show was completely manufactured.
Yeah, I love that phrase, cast of clowns. And I'm sure they know who they are.
Oh, of course.
So much to talk about, but we're going to move a little bit to something else. Can you speak about the repression of the media in Iran, as well as the representations of Iran in global media coverage? For example, at the beginning, the regime instituted a blackout against independent media outlets like the English language Iran Daily. At least 10 journalists were arrested during the anti-government protests in December of 2025. At the same time, since this illegal act of war by the US and Israel, coverage of it has been completely skewed. As I said in my introduction, there's been disinformation. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, Iran does not have freedom of the press at all. It never has it never has, period. I can say that. It isn't just something that happened from 1979 onwards. We never had a real freedom of the press. And there are independent journalists, of course, who have been taken hostage, not just independent journalists inside the country, but also independent journalists who have come into the country to cover things. I mean, Jason Rezaian, for instance, from the Washington Post, was imprisoned for 447 days. Maziar Bahari, a lot of people, right, throughout the years. And some have even been killed, including a Montreal-based Iranian-Canadian photojournalist named Zahra Kazemi in 2003. She was brutalized and tortured for 3 days and succumbed to her injuries, never got any accountability or justice for her. So the brutality of the Iranian regime when it comes to journalism is well noted. And that shouldn't be used as a reason to, send 2,000-pound bombs onto a government.
Absolutely not.
But of course it will be. And, I don't want anything I say or do to be used as a weapon in order to, run cover for the war that is happening in Iran right now. But it is, as I said, well documented, the repression of journalists in Iran. Look, that's one of the reasons I don't go to Iran. I haven't been to Iran since 1999. For decades, I've written about Iran's egregious human rights violations, and I have a worry to go there, right? I know that I am a prize for the Iranian government. Not only am I a dual national, but I'm also a journalist. Perfect thing to take hostage and use as leverage. So I don't dare step foot in the country under these circumstances.
And so we know that, as you said, there's been a lot of repression, but also there's no freedom of press in Iran. But at the same time, since the illegal war started, the coverage of this has been incredibly, one can call it strange, but one could also say it is intentionally being done to distort and to persuade in ways that are perhaps unhelpful to the people of Iran.
Yeah, I mean, it's war pigs on parade. And if you look at the Canadian media outlets right now, and I'll just talk about them for a second, not a single person who is against this war has been put on the air. Not once. I've been religiously documenting this. I've been watching CTV, CBC, and there has been not one voice saying this is an illegal war, this is a sovereign nation, and this war was launched under false auspices.
Absolutely.
Yesterday, and this is something that is totally removed, yesterday, Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Association, said Iran was nowhere near having a nuclear bomb. You had the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, coming out and saying, we support this war because it wants to get rid of Iran's nuclear capabilities. Well, I thought we got rid of Iran's nuclear capabilities in June. What's interesting is you even heard Rafael Grossi in June saying they are nowhere near having a bomb. Okay, so then they said it's ballistic missiles. Right, fine, it's ballistic missiles. Not a threat, can't reach America or Europe. The reason this war is being waged, and no one talks about it, is because Israel and America want another client-servile state in the region, which is what they have with Syria right now, which is what they have with Lebanon. Lebanon is being totally invaded right now.
As we speak, yes.
Completely invaded. Israel wants the Litani River waterway. And you had the vile Bezalel Smotrich today come out and say, which will never be shown in legacy media in North America, he actually said the Dahia district will become Khan Yunis.
He said that today.
Today, 2 hours before I arrived into this studio, he said that. I will bet you $100 that you won't see that quoted anywhere in Canadian media. Lebanon is being invaded. Israel will once again occupy the whole of southern Lebanon. They told more than 300,000 people today to evacuate it. Tehran is a city of 16 million people. Iran is the 17th largest country in the world. It is the size of Western Europe. When you tell a city of 16 million, go that way, where do you think they have to go? Because we're about to bomb. So the same Gaza playbook is what we're seeing in Tehran. They've bombed a primary school full of young girls. They've killed 165 of them, including 5 teachers and some parents. They've bombed a sports stadium.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? This was one of the jewels of, people don't know this, but it was one of the architectural jewels of Iran, this sports stadium. They've bombed the Senate building, another architectural jewel of Tehran. It was built in 1958 by one of our most famous architects. Their strikes have ruined a 15th century palace in Iran. Iran is in the top 10 of having the most UNESCO heritage sites. I'm sorry if I get emotional at this part, but these are not things that can be rebuilt. We are a 5,000-year-old civilization. We've actually never gone to or instigated any war in our lives.
And that's important to point out.
In our entire history.
Exactly.
Ever. People don't realize this. We've never been the aggressor. We went through an 8-year war of attrition with Iraq, which all the other European countries helped Saddam Hussein. For 8 years, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. We were gassed by German gases that were supplied to Saddam Hussein. And nobody talks about that. Nobody. Iran is made out to be the aggressor, which is a primordial joke because Israel came out itself and said, we preemptively struck Iran. So we're in an upside down right now. 2 + 2 = 5. And, we're all expected to just go along with this, right? While millions of Iranians are being bombed with no end game. Remember that. There's no end game here. The end game is destruction, chaos, and the tearing apart of a country that is too big to tame.
You said so many important things, and I just want to emphasize one point, is that Iran has never initiated any violent actions against other countries. It has absolutely defended itself. And this is something that the media seems not to have caught up with.
They don't care. They don't care for context. They really don't. They don't care for providing any historical context. It would take 2 minutes. 2 minutes to have a guest say these things.
Yeah.
2 minutes to have an Iranian who can actually hold more than 1 or 2 thoughts at the same time come on the air and say, yes, this is a brutal government, but I don't want my country destroyed or my people killed.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah. This goes to my next question. I have friends in the Iranian diaspora who I met from my time living in London to living here in Toronto. I have students from the Iranian diaspora who I've spoken to about this since the war began. And in pictures that are posted, in things that are said, I see members of the Iranian diaspora, not everyone, but a segment of them, flying Israeli flags, draped around them, showing support for the war. What's going on with this misinformation or disinformation of, that somehow this war is a good thing for Iranians, and how do you deal with that?
I describe it as desperation and delusion. I hope this doesn't sound bad. Compare us to, I would say, the Cuban diaspora, how long has this siege on Cuba been? 60, how many years is it now? 60, 70? I don't know how long it's been. But they don't care right now that Cubans are living in the dark, wondering where their next meal is coming from. We are a traumatized diaspora. And I recently wrote this. I said, we are a dangerous diaspora who doesn't have much knowledge about what Israel does to other places. What Iranians know is that for 47 years, the government that I hate, so the Iranian government that I hate, has told me to say death to Israel. So because I hate that government, I'm going to love Israel. It's the classic juvenile, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that's the excuse I'm creating in my mind to not think my entire diaspora is despicable. That's the excuse. And it is a juvenile way of thinking because, and I know this because when I speak to Iranians, they don't know much about Israel's actual activity. They don't know about its history. They don't know how it was formed, how Palestinians are subjugated under it. They really don't. All they know is that Palestine or Palestinians, their subjugation has been rammed down their throats, right? In school, you are taught to chant death to Israel, death to America. So when you sort of live in that closed, this is what the regime tells me to do, I'm going to go against that. Now, having said that, there is immense propaganda launched towards Iranians. The IDF has a page on Instagram called IDF Farsi, where they broadcast right into Iran. And you might want to discount social media, but I don't. It is a very powerful and effective tool for states to get their propaganda out. And like all propaganda, there is a nugget of truth to everything. So how is this fed to Iranians? 2,500 years ago, we had Cyrus the Great who freed the Jews and helped them build the Second Temple. We are children of Cyrus, and now the Jews are helping to free us. Mm-hmm. That's the rhetoric. Underlying all of that is a despicable anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism. Yeah. So Iranians were colonized 1,400 years ago, and we are going back to what we were, right? All nationalist movements, all fascist right-wing movements are always going back.
Yeah, this kind of nostalgia that is completely invented. In
Absolutely.
Some ways, yeah.
Make America great again.
Exactly.
And, MIGA, make Iran great again. Like, that's the movement, right? And it's so delusional. And I'm sorry to use that word, but there are people in the diaspora, and I don't want to say all people, because I have to point this out. I get dozens of messages every day from people thanking me for things I say and write because they're too afraid to.
I was thinking the same thing, yeah.
There is a situation in the diaspora right now that people who are pushing for regime change or who want to install certain people into power are becoming very violent towards their fellow Iranians. And it's very dangerous, because it's been very effective. People are afraid to speak out. What you're seeing, the only thing you're shown is people going outside the American embassy here in Toronto going, thank you, Trump, thank you, you've saved us. Liberation doesn't come at the tip of a bomb. That's where death comes, death and destruction.
Which is ongoing right now.
Absolutely.
I have a couple of questions, of which I'll keep them short, because I know time is running out.
Doesn't mean I'll keep the answer short.
Absolutely.
That's my problem.
Absolutely great for us.
Yeah.
Orientalism is a theme that runs through this podcast. And it runs through the reporting that has been happening in West Asia more broadly, but also specifically we're talking about Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank. We're also speaking about Iran.
Yes.
How do you see Orientalism featuring in the reporting of what's going on?
It's glaringly obvious in a bunch of stuff, and I'll talk to you about this because I was actually I've been researching this for months. There is this idea, and it goes back to, as you mentioned, sort of this going back that all nationalist movements do, that we are Persian, we are not Arab, and that this religion and this system of governance was forced on us. And it goes back to sort of, as I said, this anti-Arab, anti-Muslim rhetoric. But that is coupled with people like Sam Harris, who is, the darling of liberal secularists, who says things like, well, Iran is not Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya. These are quotes. They're a very sophisticated people. They're Persian. So there's this exceptionalism, right? This Orientalism, this sort of exceptionalism that is really feeding into this Iranian, Persian sort of rhetoric that we are better than our neighbors. We're better than those barefoot Arabs. These are things I hear people say. This isn't just theory. So there's that. And then you have people like Mark Levin, who came out and said, these people are Persian. They're not, like their neighbors. And then he actually said, they're Western.
Wow.
And it's having a massive impact. I mean, it's something that they know. And by they, I mean the imperialist powers, particularly Israel and America. They know how to use this Orientalist language to bolster and make Iranians feel good about themselves, right? And use that, hearkening back to a time when none of this existed. We are the children of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great is constantly invoked, just constantly invoked. Everywhere. At Davos, you had it. I mean, these are representatives who are using this language, right, on world stages, in Munich, everywhere. At protests, you hear it said, "You are the children of Cyrus." I mean, I'm the children of my mom and dad.
Yeah.
But if you say things like that, people attack you. The moment you start questioning this rhetoric and, talking about how, hey guys, that's exactly how Hitler used to talk. Right now at protests, Iranian protests, you hear people say one flag, one leader, one nation.
Wow.
Well, where did you hear that before?
Well, that
Ein Volke, ein Führer. I mean, the people who are repeating these things are wholly ignorant of that history. They don't know what they're doing. And so I will provide them that excuse because I do know that they're wholly ignorant. They don't get it. But at this point, when you're watching these bombs fall, crushing your people, killing 165 schoolgirls, yesterday I asked, what's it going to take to wake up? What's it going to take? Because it's not going to end well.
No, absolutely not. But Iran somehow as well, from the left, has been this protector of a Palestinian liberation and somehow also seen to be
the resistance.
The resistance, yeah. The axis, of this movement against the imperialist US and Israel. So which is why I find sometimes on both sides, people can fantasize what Iran is about. I think you said it best. And I'm not going to quote you because I don't have the quote with me. But you did say at some point that people use Iran like pieces on a chessboard as a projection of their own either fantasy or fears.
Their ideological bent, yeah. It's unfortunate. And I would have loved to have seen the left protest for the people of Iran. I would have loved to seen QP come out, not when Iran gets bombed, but it should, but when the protesters were on the streets of Iran. It would have been great to see that, but we didn't. And the reason for that is because people are so afraid to get caught up in this imperialist framework that the West is launching this war on, right? I don't want to speak out against Iran right now because I don't want to be seen as someone who is complacent or complicit in what the West is doing to the country. And that has always been something that the Iranian state has used from its inception in 1979, this system of governance. Iran has always positioned itself as an anti-imperialist voice. But what has Iran actually done for Palestine and Palestinians? I mean, it abandoned them once Arafat got behind. Don't forget, Arafat supported Saddam Hussein in the 8-year war of attrition that killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians. And once Arafat accepted Israel's right to exist, Iran abandoned Arafat and went towards Hamas. So I'm sure in Gaza you've seen, there's the Turkish hospital, the Indonesian hospital. Yeah. There's no Iranian hospital. There's no Iranian-funded schools. Yeah. Iran funds weapons. Iran funnels weapons. So how is Iran really helping Palestinians? It's using the Palestinians as much as everyone else is. It's using it as a way of whitewashing its own crimes on its own citizens. You can't talk about Palestinian liberation and not recognize the crimes of the Iranian government.
And very few people make these connections. Very few intelligent people as well make these connections, which is why your voice is so important and your perspective and your insights are so important. I will end with a question that is got nothing to do with the stuff that we've been talking about. And I just want to tell everyone who's listening that you should subscribe to and be a Patreon member of On The Line Media, which I have benefited so much from, to bring a counterbalance to some of the misinformation and disinformation and bias in media coverage of legacy media that's out there. But the last question is, we consider you, when I say we, I mean people who are making this podcast, including myself, we consider you to be someone who kicks ass. Metaphorically speaking, and perhaps even literally, right? But can you name us one song that you return to for inspiration in your work, in your life, when you feel like you need to kick ass?
There's, I love music. Music rules my life. I am someone that many people in this city, in Toronto, will see on a dance floor, till 5, 6 in the morning. But right now there are a couple of songs. It's not just one. One song is War Pigs by Black Sabbath. I love that song. Just the feel of it, it really gets me going. Crazy Bald Heads by Bob Marley and the Wailers. Yes. Natural Mystic by Bob Marley and the Wailers. That's who I'm really listening to right now.
Samira Mohyeddin, you have been an amazing guest with us. I thank you again for being here. And I just like to say thank you as well for all the work that you do and that you continue doing this for a long time to come, because we need more people like you. Thank you.
I do a lot of interviews. I think this is one of my favorites. Thank you very much for allowing me the time to think and to be able to sort of pull back all of the complexities that need to be pulled back.
And so important work. Thank you again.
Thank you.
This podcast series was created for the 10th anniversary of the platform, Everyday Orientalism, and in conversation with its editors, Catherine Bloy and Osama Ali Gad. To find more content and to subscribe, you can visit everydayorientalism.wordpress.com. This podcast was recorded at the University of Toronto. The land that the University of Toronto is on has always been Indigenous land. In 1827, the British King gave over 200,000 acres of Indigenous land appropriated by the Crown to the Anglican bishop to establish King's College. We wish to acknowledge that despite this history of settler colonialism, for thousands of years, this has always been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our research assistant Sophie Plotkin and our editor and producer Taylor Stark for helping make this podcast possible. Thank you for listening.